Okay, so we're in chapter 4, Mishnah Halacha 3 in the Rambam. So we're talking now about Sefichim. So Sefichim is anything that will grow by itself during the year, any product from the ground that grows by itself. Meaning it doesn't apply to trees, because trees obviously grow every year. You don't have to do anything from that. But vegetables and grains, they don't grow by themselves. They have to be planted. So there were unscrupulous people who would plant and say, oh, it came up by itself. So sometimes, I don't know, seeds could have blown somehow maybe and planted, or sometimes if you didn't fully harvest the thing the previous year, that stuff the seeds from that produce could sometimes plant itself, so to speak. So in that, the text that I gave you, it uses the word, I think, aftergrowth for Sefichim. So from that perspective, aftergrowth would mean if you left, let's say, some stalks of wheat in the field, so they could have decayed, the outer part could have decayed, and then the seeds from inside could have generated the next year and grown into new wheat. So either way, either form of those things that grow by themselves, it's prohibited. The rabbis made a decree that it's prohibited to eat anything that's not a fruit. Fruits are okay, but vegetables and grains, things like that, because if we allowed them to use it, we knew there were unscrupulous people who are going to actually plant and then say, oh, it grew by itself. So they said it's all forbidden, no way around it. So the Rambam says in Halacha Gimel, you're not allowed to eat from Shmitta produce except the fruit of the trees and the grasses that most people don't plant. So he treats it as things like rue, aramanth, and the like. But yarbuz and ashotim is some type of wild jasmine, or not jasmine, but aval hayirako. So those are not things. The fact that it's shota literally means a fool, but in this context, it probably means something that grows by itself wild. So people don't plant it. If it grows wild, and people never plant it, the Rabbanan didn't make a decree against using it. The Lama Gazra, but things that most people plant in a planting area, and produce, and grains and beans, anything that sprouts from them is prohibited from rabbinic edict. And someone who collects those or harvests those products get rabbinic lashes. So Rav Kook mentions the red vase, that if you gathered, even if you didn't eat it, it's forbidden, and you get the rabbinic lashes. And certainly this would be the same status, that you would get rabbinic lashes for eating it, even if you didn't gather it. Let's say I told Johnny to gather it, or Johnny did gather Sefichim, and then I got it from Johnny. So for the fact that I ate Sefichim, I would get rabbinic lashes also. And the Ramban in Chumash says that vegetables, even though the law follows in regard to Truma and Meiser, it depends when you picked it. And if it all gathered in the 6th year and it was gathered in Shmitta, it has holiness. So why is this important? So Truma, which is the part that gets taken off and given to the Kohen, is taken off every year. The Meiser, the tithe that's taken off and given to the Levi, is taken off every year. But there's a difference in the second Meiser. On the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years of the Shmitta cycle, you take Meiser Sheni and you have the second tithe, and you eat that in Yerushalayim. In the 3rd and 6th year, instead of Meiser Sheni, you keep it local and you give that amount to the poor people. So in regard to vegetables, so let's say, so for vegetables, it doesn't matter when it was growing, it just matters when you picked it. So let's say I pick it the day after Rosh Hashanah. So because Rosh Hashanah changes the year in the Shmitta cycle, whatever day it is, even though it grew 99.9% during the 5th year, let's say, which is a Meiser Sheni year, but because I picked it after Rosh Hashanah, it's considered produce of the 6th year, and you don't have to eat in Yerushalayim, you give it to poor people. So according to the Ramban, if it grew all in the 6th year and you gathered it in the 7th year, it's considered Shemitah produce. However, the Ramban says the Sefichim doesn't apply to it. Sefichim only applies to stuff that primarily or the majority of it grew in the Shemitah year. Meaning we know that if it's, within a couple months after Shmitta, after Rosh Hashanah of Shmitta, we know that these vegetables were not planted on Shmitta, 100%. We know it couldn't have been planted. We know it was planted before Shmitta. So according to the Ramban, the prohibition of Sefichim does not apply if most of the growth occurred in the 6th year. The majority. You can't plant it Erev Rosh Hashanah or a week before Rosh Hashanah, according to the Rambam. It had to have a majority of its growth before Shmitta. And if the majority of its growth was on Shmitta, then it's prohibited from Sefichim. But if it was growing on the 6th year, even though it was gathered after Rosh Hashanah of Shmitta, it has the status of Shemitah produce, but it does not, so you're not allowed to sell it, you're not allowed to waste it, but it does not have the rabbinic prohibition of Sefichim. These vegetables that we find in the words of the sages, which have sanctity of Kedusha Shvius, and so the Ramban says that this explains whenever the Gemara talks about vegetables that have Kedusha Shvius, this is what we're talking about. Because otherwise it would be prohibited from rabbinic. So how would you ever have vegetables that you're using on Shmitta? Unless you use the leniency of the Chazon Ish that we spoke about on Shavuos night. And the Rambam says in Perush HaMishnah in the 9th parak, when we say that there's permitted vegetables to eat during Shmitta, even though they have the laws of Shmitta, that's only about these types of vegetables in this halacha, that most people do not plant them, but they grow by themselves in wild places like mountains and by streams of water. So then there's no Shmitta at all, even if everything would have been in Shmitta. So the Ramban brings an opinion, and the Rambam's opinion is that, let's say I know that this wild amaranth grew all during Shmitta, but since no one plants that stuff, even if the whole thing was from Shmitta, you're allowed to use it on Shmitta, and there's no laws of Sefichim. Now he doesn't say here, but would they have the status of Perush Shvius? Would you not be able to waste them? Would you not be able to sell them? You probably wouldn't be allowed to, but it's just, this was only a leniency in regard to the laws of Sefichim. So we find that things that grow like this, even though they have sanctity of Shmitta, and they're not prohibited because of Sefichim, and there are some types of species that are Sefichim completely. So then there's two categories of stuff. So the stuff that grows by itself, there's no prohibition of Sefichim, and then everything else, there is a prohibition of Sefichim. Now, the Yerushalmi mentions that I think it's one of the species of maror, olshin, is endives, I think. So it talks about that normally people don't eat endives. They're bitter. Why would anyone eat something bitter? But on Shmitta, when there's not as many vegetables available, people eat endives. So something that's not usually in people's diets, it is for Shmitta. Now, in regard, what did the Yerushalmi say? I don't remember that detail. So I'm sorry, I have to look it up and report back to you. And then another opinion, the Rash opinion in the 9th chapter, is that the species that have kedusha shvius and they have the laws of Sefichim, it's the only way you could have those vegetables if they grew completely on Shmitta and were gathered on Shmitta, then they're prohibited because of Sefichim. But if they grew during the 6th year, even though they were gathered on the 7th year, even if they only had a little bit of their growth during the 6th year, and most of it was in the 7th year, and it was picked in the 7th year, they are not prohibited from Sefichim, which would prohibit the rabbinic prohibition of eating them or gathering them, but they are perush shvius that have to be eaten with sanctity of Shmitta and all of the laws of Shmitta. You can't waste them, you can't sell them, etc. But if the entire growth was in the 7th year and then they were picked in the 8th year when it's not Shmitta anymore, it appears that according to that they are prohibited because of Sefichim. But for grain, we don't find, according to this opinion, any case where grain would have sanctity of Shmitta, where the laws of Sefichim would apply to grain. Because if it grew a third of its way before Shmitta, now a third of its growth is important. That's it's called onas hamaisros, when it's developed enough that now it can become required in tithes. Meaning if you eat it before, when it's super small, you don't have to take tithes off because it's not considered finished. Once it grew a third of the way, and it's lahavdil, I mean, an analogy, it's not the same thing, but analogy is when you cook on Shabbos, if you're cooking something that's going to continue cooking on Shabbos, it has to reach at least partial cooking, machal ben drusai, which is, according to most opinions, halfway cooked, or according to some opinions, a third of the way cooked. Once it's reached that much level of cooking before Shabbos, you could let it continue cooking on Shabbos. So that's why when you make a chalent, it has to be at least half cooked before Shabbos, or else you're not allowed to let it continue cooking because it's continuing cooking on Shabbos. So similar thing for Shmitta, that according to, in regard to all agricultural laws, the agricultural laws of separating tithes and stuff don't apply until it reached at least a certain minimum growth, which is a third. So if grain reached a third of its growth before Shmitta, then it's completely allowed according to this opinion of the Rash. There's no prohibition of Sefichim, that has no sanctity of Shmitta, because it's an important principle that for grain we follow a third of its growth. And if it didn't reach a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah, then it has the laws of Sefichim completely, and you're not allowed to pick it. So you would never be allowed to pick grain, and you would never have grain that the laws of the sanctity of Shmitta, because either there's not even the laws of Sefichim against it, or you're not allowed to pick it even because of Sefichim. But there's a special status, a special law for grain, that if you gathered it before it had reached its ripening amount of growth, and you picked it to be hay for your animal, then even if it didn't reach a third of its growth before Shmitta, and now it's Shmitta, even if you would wait for it to reach a third of its growth, it would become prohibited from Sefichim. But if you gathered it before it reached a third of its growth, because you're going to give it to your animal, then there's no prohibition. So that's a big loophole, but again, that doesn't help for people food. And in that case, it doesn't even have sanctity of Shmitta, because as a grass or hay, things like that, it was grown enough before Shmitta. So it wouldn't even be like a vegetable that follows when you pick it. Okay, what if you had grain that grew less than a third before Shmitta, somehow it grew on Shmitta? So it was less than a third of its growth by the time Rosh Hashanah hit, and now it's the 8th year. So if you will eat it as regular growth, the law of Sefichim doesn't apply. And it seems, says Rav Kook, that there is no problem. It doesn't have sanctity of Shmitta either, since in produce we follow a third of its growth, and here it didn't have a third of its growth during Shmitta year. But if you would have harvested it in terms of hay for your animal, then it would have sanctity because it had reached its peak growth in regard to being animal feed before while it was still Shmitta. But it seems that according to that, it wouldn't be prohibited because of Sefichim either. because if it was a vegetable, we would say there's no permitted way to harvest it. But since really it's a grain, again, it's a loophole here that you end up not having a problem with. Because for grain, it's not considered grain yet because it didn't grow a third. So then it won't have Sefichim. Or possibly because there's other grasses that grow by themselves. So therefore, we don't apply the law of Sefichim to grasses at all. Now the Rambam does mention it, but I guess he's saying this opinion doesn't, because the Rambam says the word hasav in grasses, and he's saying that we don't have to worry about that. And then the Rash also brings down an opinion in the same place that Sefichim you're not allowed to pick, but there's no prohibition to eat them. So we started out by saying according to the Radvaz says according to the Rambam, if you harvest it, according to the Rambam who says if you harvest or pick Sefichim, you get rabbinic lashes. The Rabbi says certainly if someone else picked it, but you got it from him and you ate it, you also have lashes. The Rash brings an opinion that says there's no prohibition to eat it if someone else picked it. And it seems that according to this opinion, the main prohibition of Sefichim is only to gather a lot of them at the same time. It looks like your owner. Even if it would be a different type of vegetable that you would be allowed to gather in this manner on Shmitta, if it's Sefichim, you're not allowed to gather it in this way. Meaning, the only case you would be able to, according to this opinion, is you pick it and you eat it right away. If you gather more than a few things to bring home, that's not okay. You literally have to pick it and eat it right away. Well, or I guess if you pick 3 of them and eat them right away too, that's okay too. You don't have to literally eat them one by one, but you're not even taking them home probably. Now, an important thing though, what about your animals? If you're a shepherd, what do you have to do? So animals are allowed to graze the way they normally and eat whatever it separates. And who's this? The Kafto Referach, which is a book on Hilchos Yisrael, says that Sefichim in regard to cabbage or kale, we saw is what Professor Felix translates it, is on a Torah level, and everything else it's only on a rabbinic level, because we saw that the kale looks like a little tree, so they were more strict on that. So since you're not able to distinguish between a new growth and an old growth, the Torah prohibited it even as a Sefichim, and so that you won't try to make a distinction and make a mistake between the kale aftergrowth and everything else. They said everything else is usher, but it's not equal. But according to this, the kale is usher midiraisa. It's a special Sefichim diraisa. Halacha dalet. Sefichim ha'olam b'stei vor u'b'stei nir u'b'stei kerem u'b'stei zera. So these sprouts that grow in a field with poor nutrients and poor outcomes, or in a very finely plowed field, or in a vineyard, or in a regular, or in a field where you plant other things. Now, in a stabor, you don't want anything to plant. So nowadays we call it crop rotation. So you hadn't done crop rotation, so there's very poor yields in this field. So you don't want to plant anything, because anything that you plant is going to keep the field as a poor developing and a poor yielding field. A very finely plowed field, you want it finely plowed to plant your good cash crops or whatever you were going to plant, not these little things. And a vineyard, you don't want to plant anything in, because then it becomes kalayim. Kalayim is, we mentioned, it's a form of shatnez, or shatnez is actually a form of kalayim, a forbidden mixture. And in a field that you have planted other things in, you don't want other things. You want what you planted. So in those cases, mutar b'achila, those stuff you're allowed to eat. If they grew in those 4 places, you're allowed to eat. Why didn't Chachamim make a gzera in those cases? People don't plant anything in these places. Stay bor, ein adam nifna l'sham. It's so bad, no one goes there. Stay near, rotzu b'tikuna. You plowed it very well, so you want it to stay very well plowed. Stay karam eno oser karmo. You don't want to. He doesn't want to prohibit his vineyard, his grapes, because of kalayim. Ustei zera hasfichim mafsidin also. If you planted something else there, the sfichim, these sprouts that would grow, are going to take away from the stuff that you planted. So you don't want them there. No one would plant it there, so Chachamim didn't have to decree that those are prohibited. And straw or hay for the animals is prohibited everywhere there is no prohibition of sfichim. Okay, Rav Kook says, when the Rambam says that these type of sfichim are permitted, you're only allowed to eat it. It's but you do have to treat them like they have sanctity of Shmitta for all laws. That you're not allowed to buy and sell them, and you're not allowed to make to waste them. And you have to do beer at the time of the beer. So remember, beer is, according to the Rambam, you literally have to burn it. According to the Ramban, at the other extreme, you have to declare it ownerless when it's no longer available for the wild animals in the field. And Rav Kook says, so we only said that these things that grew in these situations don't have the laws of Sefichim, is only a heter to eat them. But but they're not considered, but they still are considered Shemitah produce, period. Similarly, Sefichim doesn't apply in a field of Tilson. Tilson, I forget right now what it is. Tilson is fenugreek. Because okay, so fenugreek, sometimes you plowed it to use, and sometimes you just plowed it to have more seeds. So if you had planted it for seeds, the laws of Sefichim don't apply, even though some people do grow it for its vegetables. And I think fenugreek, if I'm not mistaken, fenugreek is a little bit special because part of the fenugreek is considered kitnius on Pesach and we don't eat it, and part of it is okay. I think the root is, if I'm not mistaken, but we have to look it up in the CRC booklet. I think fenugreek, the stuff from above ground is usable on Pesach, but the stuff from the ground is considered kitnius, and we don't use it on Pesach. But if you planted it for a vegetable, it's considered like a vegetable, and of course the laws of Sefichim apply. But when you planted fenugreek in a field to just have more seeds so you can plant fenugreek the next year, then it's considered like a sown field, and you don't want Sefichim growing there because it takes away from the main crop that's growing there. The Radvaz distinguishes between, so at the end of the halacha, it talked about straw for the animals. The Radvaz says that that's talking about big straw, which is not animal food. Then there's no Sefichim. But the smaller stuff, which is animal food, it's considered like grain, and it has the laws of Sefichim. However, Rashi and Tosfos and Tainus say that it seems that all straw and hay are prohibited, just like any regular the laws of Sefichim apply to it, just like they apply to any grain. Halacha hay, and there's no, Rav Kook doesn't have anything to end it, so we'll read halacha hay and vav, and then continue. So, hey, Sefichim shel shviyah sheyotzel motzei shviyah sashon b'achila. So let's say you had these sprouted things from Shmitta. Now it's no longer Shmitta anymore. Can I pick them now? No, they're still prohibited to eat them. And you're not even allowed to harvest it. So it's not just it's usher to eat. You're not allowed to harvest it because it looks like you're, well, I shouldn't say it's because it looks like, but it looks like you're doing ownership on something that grew during Shmitta. You're not allowed to harvest it in a regular way. You just have to plow the land, and then by plowing it, this stuff is going to be uprooted. Or you could just let animals graze on that land. So now, what about something that sprouted very late in Shmitta year? Is it ever going to be mutter in the 8th year? All these things are prohibited until Hanukkah. So anything that grew by Hanukkah, we said, had a significant portion of its growth on Shmita, so it's prohibited because of Sefichim. But once you hit Chanukah, you are allowed to pick and have those sprouted vegetables, even though they sprouted on Shmita. And if you planted the Sefichim of Shmita after Shmita, the stuff that grew out of them is permitted. So even though it came from something which was prohibited, but because you plant it and it grows by natural processes of growing, not just because it came from something usher, it's considered permitted. Now the Ravid says, let me find the Ravid here so you could read it inside. The Ravid says on this halacha that it's prohibited until Chanukah. So the Ravid says, I didn't see any source to this halacha, not in the Mishnah, not in the Tosefta, not in the Yerushalmi. Maybe he learned it from a Mishnah that says, when are you able to get benefit and burn, I guess, in your oven, the straw of Shemitah year? That's when the second rainfall happens. And depending on when the rainfall doesn't happen, the Beis Din organizes a communal fast. So because that has to do for Chanukah, so maybe that's where the Rambam gets it from, but that's not a source for this halacha. So the Ravid says that the Rambam made this out of thin air, so he disagrees with it. The only possibility that the Ravid says is maybe there is a halacha that when if you would plant stuff permittedly after Shemitah was over, once those crops would be the majority of crops, as to the earlier stuff, then it's mutter. So he says, maybe the Rambam says that the time that this happens is Chanukah, but there's no source for this. That's what the Ravid says on this halacha. So according to the Ravid, says Rav Kook, if you knew it grew after Shmita, you're never allowed to take it even after Shmita. The only time that it's mutter is when that you'd be allowed to eat it is when stuff that was planted after Shmita grew and outnumbered these prohibited Sefichim. And the boundary time that at some point it becomes mutter only applies to straw and hay. And that after that time, it's not considered Shemitah produce anymore, because anything that was in the field has now been ruined because it got wet in the rain, and the rain was causing it to rot or decay a little bit. And then in regard to the fact, what if you took seeds from these illegally or these rabbinically banned Sefichim? What if you took seeds from those things and planted it after Shvius? So the Rambam says that the plants that grow from that is permitted. So some explain, based on the Yerushalmi Trumos in the 9th parak, that that's only talking about where the seed decays and no longer exists. But if the seed doesn't decay, then it's never going to be permitted, because once the prohibited item still remains in some form, it can never become mutter. So for example, again, it's not a perfect analogy, but if milk fell into your chicken soup, and there was a piece of chicken that was out of the soup, and the milk fell into that piece of chicken. So even in a case where you can mix it up right away, and we say that there's 60 times in the entire stuff against the milk that fell in, that piece of chicken you still have to throw out. It's not a perfect analogy, but because if this seed came from a prohibited thing and the seed itself doesn't get decayed in the process of germinating, I don't remember, I saw before, but I don't remember right now what are some seeds that have this property that they're not. So since that was prohibited, it's and that still exists, the new growth, the next generation remains usher. The only time it is mutter is when that prohibited seed decayed. This is what some people say. And the Mishnah Rishona in Truma says, or based on what the Mishnah Rishona says in Trumos, it appears to say, says Rav Kook, that this heter, that you're allowed to use the plant from the seeds of the Sefichim of Shmitta, that's when, if they don't have any sanctity of Shmitta at all. So if it would have sanctity of Shmitta, then you wouldn't be allowed to plant it either. So according to his opinion also, any fruit of Shmitta that, or produce of Shmitta that grew, that you're able to use that which grows from them, then it seems that if their growth, if you would plant them and they would be permitted to eat, it shows that those seeds or that those plants do not have kedusha shvius. Zion. Onions. Now we know onions can stay in the ground for a long time. Onions that it is now after Shmita. Now it's the 8th year. So if they grew now after Shmita, the same amount that they had grown during Shmita, then they're allowed. Meaning, let's say an onion grew on Shmita and it was 2 ounces. Maybe I'm saying a little bit too big. And then you have to let it stay in the ground till it grows another 2 ounces. Then it's considered, then you'd be allowed to have it because the growth from after Shmita has reached and now surpassed, or even though it didn't surpass, but it reached the amount that it grew on Shmita, then it's considered that this onion is now an 8th year product. But if it has not grown more during the 8th year than it grew during Shmita, you are not allowed to use it for the 8th year because it's considered Shmita produce, and not just that, because of Sefichim. V'chein shar peros, and other produce, he says fruits, but other produce, and you're only allowed to pick them once they have developed enough after Shmita, equal to the amount that they grew on Shmita. Once so sometimes you have earlier ripening crops, and then you have later ripening of the same type of crop. So once the earlier ones have grown enough post Shmita that they've surpassed or reached their earlier growth, then even the later stuff becomes mutter, even though that later growing stuff didn't yet reach that amount of growth. And you're allowed to buy vegetables immediately after Shmita in the 8th year. Okay. Rav Kook says the Gra's opinion is, the Vilna Gaon's opinion is, the source of this heter of the onions, that once it as long as it grows in the 8th year equal to the amount that it grew in the Shmita year, is not talking about Shmita of onions of the 7th year, because those are definitely Shmita onions. But we're talking about, and those have Sefichim, but we're talking about We're talking about 6th year onions that you picked after Shmita started, after Rosh Hashanah. So they grew a little bit on Shmita. So they're not also because of Sefichim, because they were definitely grown before Rosh Hashanah, as we said earlier. But still, we have to treat them as Shmita produce, and we have to use all stringencies of Shmita produce. So these 6th year onions, if you kept them in the earth the entire Shmita year, and now it's Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, they immediately become permitted, and they're considered like completely. So meaning you kept them in the earth, in the ground a little bit more than a year, meaning they were sprouting before Shmita started, you kept them in the earth the entire year, and now it's the next Rosh Hashanah already. You're allowed to have them immediately, and there's no laws of Shmitta. The reason for this, that once it grew after the Shmitta year, equal to the amount that it grew on Shmitta, there's two reasons why it's mutter. The Rabbi says here, either because the way he's saying it now is not the way I was explaining. So I have to change the way I explain this halacha. We're not talking about, so what we were just saying, that you left the onion in the ground the whole year. But what we're talking about is if you had onions that reached a certain size and they were from Shmitta, you have to wait till onions that were planted after Shmitta reach the same size. That's what we're talking about here. So the Radvaz says, so how come you're allowed to, once the new onions reach that size, you're allowed to pick the old onions? So either we say that we could assume that this onion is from a post-Shmitta onion. So according to that reason, you could only apply this heter in a case where you have some reasonable doubt if this vegetable is not from Shmitta. That maybe it was from the 8th year produce. So then the Chachamim allowed you to say, oh, if you're not sure, you could, if the post-Shmitta onions have grown that size already, then you could take one that you weren't sure if it was a post-Shmitta onion or not. And it seems, when I say, I've been saying it seems a lot. Now the Rav Kook says V'nir Hadvarim, which really means from the aforementioned, it appears that, meaning he's saying, using the logic of what this commentator just said, this is a logical next step. But the commentator didn't actually say that. So when I've been saying it seems, that's what I mean. Rav Kook is saying, based on the logic, the following would follow as a result of that. So that they were lenient to say that you could follow the majority of the produce, even if not all of them, meaning let's say some onions now have reached that size, but it wasn't the majority of onions. So you could be lenient and say, oh, even though the majority of onions that planted after Shmitta haven't reached this size yet, but since some did, when we have a doubt when the onion is, we can be lenient and we allow you to use the whole onion. And also you could say that which happens in one region applies to a different region also. And also when the Rambam says, if the earlier ripening stuff is permitted, now even the later ripening stuff becomes permitted, because we could assume that, or the halacha allows us to assume that these onions or whatever produce came from the earlier ripening stuff. But if we know for sure that these are from Shmitta produce, it doesn't matter that some of the onions that were planted after Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year already grew this big. It doesn't remove the prohibition of Sefichim, and it doesn't say that produce with the sanctity of Shmitta no longer has the sanctity of Shmitta. And it does not allow us to harvest it. So that's one opinion, one explanation. But there's another explanation, that how come these onions are permitted, that stuff that's grown afterwards reach this size. That's only in a case where there is a majority now of new produce. So in this case, the stuff that's available in the market, the majority is from 8th year produce. So according to this, according to the first explanation, it only applied when you had a reasonable doubt, maybe this fruit wasn't a Shmitta produce. But according to this reason, even when you know that the first produce was from Shmitta, but this allows you to nullify it in a sense in the new crop. But the reason that we know that something for sure grew in Shmita is allowed is since you kept it in the ground and it keeps growing after Shmita. But so we use a principle that even though it had grown in the state of Shmita, but since it kept growing afterwards, so that kind of we follow the later growing, and and that was after Shmita. And it follows from this. So instead of it seems, so it follows from this that this heter is said only in regard to Sefichim, which is only midrabanan. Because how could you say something that you know is Shmita isn't Shmita? So you can't. So you were only allowed to say it because the Rabbanan said it's Asr. So in this case, the Rabbanan didn't say it's Asr because of Sefichim. But sanctity of Shmita, which is from the Torah, you have to follow the majority, like in all laws of Torah. When we have a doubt, the halacha is Safek D'Oraisa L'Chumra. When you have a doubt in Torah law, you have to go L'Chumra. But there is a machlokus between the Rambam and the Rashba. If Midoraisa you have to be strict, only Midrabanan you have to be strict. But it's a massive topic. So the time at which time you're allowed to buy vegetables on the 8th year. So some say it has to be, okay, so let's say it's Tzom Gedalia. It's a day after Rosh Hashanah. I'm allowed to buy vegetables right now because it's after Rosh Hashanah. So you say, no, it's not, doesn't work quite like that. Once you could get a shipment from Chutz La'aretz to import this type of vegetables from, I don't know, maybe Tyre. Tyre is not so far from Israel, or Cyprus, or something like that, or Cyprus. Tyre might be part of Cyprus. So you have to be able to import it from a close place that's outside of Israel. Even though during Shmita we prohibit to rely that which we say it was brought from Chutz La'aretz, not for Sefichim and not to uproot the sanctity of Shmita. But after Shmita, they were lenient and they relied on how long it would take to import some foreign vegetables, which was from very close to Israel. And now we could assume that they were brought from outside of Chutz La'aretz. And there's a different opinion. The Vilna Gaon's opinion is that when the Rambam says you could have it immediately after Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, it does mean 2 or 3 days. Since Eretz Yisrael ripens very fast, it's called an Eretz Tzvi, we can say that in 2 or 3 days, it was able to grow very fast. Now, there is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah about this, but it's talking about, it actually says, I think 4 or 5 days, but it's talking about that the Korban Omer that they brought from the year that they came into Eretz Yisrael, they had to know that it actually grew that year. So they say so the Gemara there in Rosh Hashanah says it's Eretz Tzvi, it just like a deer runs fast. It's a land that its produce ripens very quickly. So it miraculously, grain for the Omer grew very quickly.
Rabbi Benson.
Yeah, what?
No, sorry, I have to leave for this. We have like 5 minutes left.
Just have like 2 more minutes. So yeah, you have to leave for your share. You can.
I need to leave. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
And some make a distinction. The Malacha Shlomo says that we only allowed to have vegetables after Shmita immediately if it's vegetables that don't last and their seeds wouldn't last. But if the vegetables last, like onions, you're not allowed to have it immediately. So meaning something, let's say tomatoes. We know that tomatoes rot after, let's say, 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, you wouldn't be allowed to have tomatoes because they're probably from Shmita. But once it's 2 weeks later, since most tomatoes don't last that long, I'm just using tomatoes as an example. Maybe it's a bad example, but it's what comes to mind. You're allowed to use it. So therefore, something like potatoes, which again didn't exist in the Chachamim, the Chazal didn't know about potatoes, and or onions, which did last for a long time in the ground, you wouldn't be allowed to use them immediately after Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, because there's a very high probability that they're Shmitta produce that's lasted this long. And it follows from this that according to this, the vegetables that last would be just like grains. You have to wait till the new product, the new crop that you planted after Shmitta has ripened. Okay, well, what about onions that grew in the 6th year? You pick the onions, and after you pick them, you illegally or unlawfully planted them during Shmitta, and they grew a little bit on Shmitta. Then you uprooted them on Shmitta, and then you planted them again in the 8th year. So again, you had planted them originally in the 6th year. You picked them. Then you planted them against the halacha during Shmitta. Then you picked them, and then you planted again in the 8th year. So what about what's the status of that? So if the leaves in the 8th year are black, we follow the green, which is deep, which is shaded towards blackness. That means that it grew a little bit in the 8th year. So then we say the fact that it grew some in the 8th year, we can combine that with what grew in the 6th year, and we say that nullifies the growth that it had during Shemitah year. But if the leaves are green, a bright green, it shows that they weren't picked and they are not growing in the 8th year. Then they're forbidden because of a mixture that partially they grew in Shmitta. According to what we have explained, that Sefichim only applies to something that grew, to the opinion that says Sefichim only applies to something that grew completely in the Shemitah year. Sefichim would not apply to these onions when the leaves turned green in the 8th year. But we can treat them like any year's produce. But you have to treat them like they have sanctity of Shemitah, like any other Shemitah produce. This only is a reprieve according to this opinion of Sefichim. And it appears from Rashi in Nedarim, in a Rashba, in a Tshuva, in a Russian Nedarim, that onions of Shemitah itself, if you dug them up in the 7th year, and then you planted it in the 8th year, and they grew partially in the 8th year, and the leaves are black, they're permitted. That the growth of the 8th year makes the 7th year growth completely permitted now. And the Rash says in Perek Vav, Mishnah Gimel, and the Rash, that if they grew on Shemitah that have now moved into the 8th year, they do not become permitted by growing a little bit in the 8th year. When the leaves are black, and only when we know that that which grew in the 8th year is the majority of its growth. So you can't rely on just the color, that a little bit was grown in the 8th year. You have to know for sure that the growth of this year surpassed the growth of the previous year. So we'll leave it here for halacha ches.